Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Reason. Individuality which takes itself to be real in and for itself. The spiritual animal kingdom and deceit, or the matter in hand itself. This intrinsically real individuality is, at first, again a single and specific one. The absolute reality which it knows itself to be is therefore, as it will become aware, an abstract universal reality, lacking feeling and content, merely the empty thought of this category. We have to see how this notion of intrinsically real individuality characterizes itself in its moments, and how its notion of itself enters into its consciousness. The notion of this individuality, which as such knows itself to be all reality, is to begin with a result. It has not yet set forth its movement and reality, and is posited here immediately as a simple in itself or implicit being. Negativity, however, which is the same as that which is manifested as movement, is present in the simple in itself as a determinateness and mere being, or the simple in itself becomes a definite range of being. Accordingly, individuality appears on the scene as an original determinate nature. Original, for it is implicit. Originally determinate, for the negative moment is present in the in itself, and this latter is thus a quality. This limitation of being, however, cannot limit the action of consciousness, for here consciousness is a relation purely of itself to itself, relation to another, which would be a limitation of it, has been eliminated. The original determinateness of the nature is therefore only a simple principle, a transparent universal element in which the individuality remains as free and self-identical as it is unimpeded in unfolding its different moments, and in its realization is simply in a reciprocal relation with itself, just as in the first case of indeterminate animal life, which breathes the breath of life, let us say, into the element of water or air or earth, and within these again into more specific principles, steeping its entire nature in them, and yet keeping that nature under its own control and preserving itself as a unity in spite of the limitation imposed by the element, and remaining in the form of this particular organization, the same general animal life. This determinate original nature of consciousness, which remains free and entire in it, appears as the immediate and sole proper content of that which, for the individual, is its end. Admittedly, it is a determinate content, but it is only a content at all insofar as we consider the in itself in isolation. In truth, however, it is the reality that is permeated by individuality, actuality as it is present in consciousness, qua individual, and it is in the first instance posited as merely being, not yet as acting, but as regards action. That determinateness is on the one hand not a limitation it would want to overcome, for regarded as an existent quality, it is the simple colour of the element in which it moves. On the other hand, however, negativity is a determinateness only in being, but action is itself nothing else but negativity. Therefore, when individuality acts, determinateness is dissolved in the general process of negativity, or in the sum total of every determinateness. In action and the consciousness of action, the simple original nature now splits up into the distinction which action implies. Action is present at first in the form of object, and object too as pertaining to consciousness as end, and hence opposed to a reality already given. The second moment is the movement of the end conceived as passive, and realization conceived as the relation of the end to the wholly formal actuality. Hence the idea of the transition itself, or the means. The third moment is finally the object, which is no longer in the form of an end, directly known by the agent to be his own, but as brought out into the light of day and having for him the form of another. The notion of this sphere requires that these various aspects be grasped in such a way that the content in them remains the same without any distinction, whether between individuality and being in general, or between end as against individuality as an original nature, or between end and the given reality, or between the means and the reality as an absolute end, or between the reality brought about by the agent as against the end, or the original nature, or the means. First of all, then, the originally determinate nature, or natural predisposition of individuality, its immediate essence, is not as yet posited as active, and as such is called special capacity, talent, character, and so on. This particular tinge of spirit is to be looked on as the sole content of the end itself, and as the sole reality. If we thought of consciousness as going beyond that, and as wanting to give reality to a different content, then we should be thinking of it as not a nothing working towards nothing. Further, the original essence is not merely the content of the end, but is in itself the reality as well, which otherwise has the appearance of being a given material of the action, of being a reality found to begin with, which is to be shaped by the action. That is to say, action simply translates an initially implicit being into a being that is made explicit. The being in itself of the reality opposed to consciousness is reduced to a mere empty show. This consciousness, then, which bringing itself to act, does not let itself to be led astray by what is merely the show of a given reality, and equally it has to avoid floundering about in empty thoughts and ends, and has to hold on to the original content of its essence. True, this original content is only explicit for consciousness when the latter has made it into a reality, but the distinction between a content which is explicit for consciousness only within consciousness itself and the intrinsic reality outside it no longer exists. Consciousness must act merely in order that what is in itself may become explicit for it. In other words, action is simply the coming to be of spirit as consciousness. What the latter is in itself, it knows therefore from what it actually is. Accordingly, an individual cannot know what he really is until he has made himself a reality through action. However, this seems to imply that he cannot determine the end of his action until he has carried it out, but at the same time, since he is a conscious individual, he must have the action in front of him beforehand as entirely his own, that is, as an end. The individual who is going to act seems therefore to find himself in a circle in which each moment already presupposes the other, and thus he seems unable to find a beginning, because he only gets to know his original nature, which must be his end from the deed, while in order to act he must have that end beforehand. But for that very reason he has to start immediately, and whatever the circumstances, without further scruples about beginning, means or end, proceed to action. For his essence and intrinsic nature is beginning, means, and end all in one. As beginning, this nature is present in the circumstances of the action, and the interest which the individual finds in something is the answer already given to the question whether he should act and what should be done in a given case. For what seems to be a given reality is in itself his own original nature, which has merely the illusory appearance of an objective being and appearance implied in the notion of action, which is a twofold, with its twofold aspect, but which shows itself to be his own original nature by the interest he takes in it. Similarly, the how or the means is determined in and for itself. Talent is likewise nothing else but the determinate original individuality considered as an inner means or as a transition from end to an achieved reality. But the actual means and the real transition are the unity of talent with the nature of the matter in hand, present in that interest. Talent represents in the means the side of action, interest the side of content. Both are individuality itself as an interfusion of being and action. What we have, therefore, is a set of given circumstances which are in themselves the individual's own original nature. Next, the interest which treats them as its own or as its end, and finally the union of these and the abolition of the antithesis in the means. This union itself still falls within consciousness, and the whole, just considered, is one side of it an antithesis. This illusory appearance of an antithesis, which still remains, is removed by the transition of the means, for the means is a unity of inner and outer, the antithesis of the specific character it has as an inner means. It therefore rids itself of that character and posits itself, this unity of action and being, equally as an outer, as an individuality that has itself become reality, has become a reality. That is, an individuality which is posited for individuality itself as objectively existent. In this way, the entire action does not go outside itself, either as circumstances, or as end or means, or as a work done. But with work done, the difference of the original natures seems to enter the work, like the individual original nature which it expresses, is something specific, for the negativity implicit in action being freely discharged by it as an existent reality, is present in the action as a quality. Consciousness, however, as against the work, is determined as that in which the quality is present in negativity in general, that is, as action. But it is thus universal as against the specific character of the work done. It can therefore compare one work with another, and by so doing, grasp individualities themselves as different. It can regard an individual whose work is more wide-ranging as possessing greater energy of will, or a richer nature, that is, a nature whose native quality is less limited, and another, on the other hand, as a weaker and poorer nature. In contrast with this unessential quantitative difference, good and bad would express an absolute difference, but here this is not in place. Whether something is held to be good or bad, it is in either case an action and an activity in which an individuality exhibits and expresses itself, and for that reason it is all good, and it would, strictly speaking, be impossible to say what a badness was supposed to be. What would be called a bad work is the individual life of a specific nature, which therein gives itself reality. It would only be put down as a bad work by a comparing reflection, which, however, is an idle affair, since it goes beyond the essential nature of the world, which is to be a self-expression of the individuality, and in it looks for and demands something else. No one knows what. The comparison could only have regard to the above-mentioned difference, but this being a quantitative difference is in itself not an essential one, and here specifically because the things compared would be different works or individualities. But these have no connection with one another. Each is purely self-related. The original nature is alone the in itself, or what could be laid down as a standard for judging the work, and conversely, both, however, correspond to each other. There is nothing for individuality which has not been made so by it, or there is no reality which is not individuality's own nature and doing, and no action nor in itself of individuality that is not real, and only these moments are to be compared. Therefore, feelings of exaltation or lamentation or repentance are altogether out of place, for all that sort of thing stems from a mind which imagines a content and in itself which are different from the original nature of the individual and the actual carrying out of it in the real world. Whatever it is that the individual does, and whatever happens to him that he has done himself, and he is that himself, he can have only the consciousness of the simple transference of himself from the night of possibility into the daylight of the present, from the abstract in itself into the significance of actual being, and can have only the certainty that what happens to him in the latter is nothing else but what lay dormant in the former. It is true that the consciousness of this unity is likewise a comparison, but what is compared is merely an illusory appearance of an antithesis, an appearance of the form of antithesis, which, for self-consciousness, reason that is aware that individuality in its own self is reality, is nothing more than an illusory show. The individual, therefore, knowing that in his actual world he can find nothing else but its unity with himself, or only the certainty of himself in the truth of that world, can experience only joy in himself. This is the notion which consciousness forms of itself as an absolute interfusion of individuality and being. Let us see whether this notion is confirmed by experience, and whether its reality corresponds to it. The work produced is the reality which consciousness gives itself. It is that in which the individual is explicitly for himself what he is implicitly or in himself, and in such a manner that the consciousness for what the individual becomes explicit in the work is not the particular but the universal consciousness. In his work he has placed himself altogether in the element of universality, in a quality less void of being. The consciousness which withdraws from its work is in fact the universal consciousness in contrast to its work, which is a determinate or particular, and it is universal because it is absolute negativity or action in this antithesis. It thus goes beyond itself in the work and is itself the quality-less void, which is left unfilled by its work. But if their unity before was preserved in the notion, this happened simply because the work, qua existent, was sublated, but it is supposed to exist, and we have to see how, in its existence, the individuality will preserve its universality and will know how to satisfy itself. In the first place, we have to consider by itself the work produced. It has received into itself the whole nature of the individuality. Its being is therefore itself an action in which all differences interpenetrate and are dissolved. The work is thus expelled into an existence in which the equality of the original nature, in fact, turns against other determinate natures, encroaches on them, and gets lost as a vanishing element in this general process. Although within the notion of the objectively real individuality, all the moments, circumstances, means, ends, and realization have the same value, and the original specific nature has the value of no more than a universal element. On the other hand, when this element becomes an objective being, its specific character, as such, comes to light in the work done and obtains its truth in its dissolution. More precisely, the form which this dissolution takes is that in this specific character, the individual, qua this particular individual, has become aware of himself as actual, but the specific character is not only the content of the reality, but equally its form. In other words, the reality simply as such is just this quality of being opposed to self-consciousness. Looked at from this aspect, the reality is revealed as a reality that has vanished from the notion and is merely an alien reality that is found a given. The work is, that is, it exists for other individualities and is for them an alien reality, which they must replace by their own in order to obtain through their action the consciousness of their unity with reality. In other words, their interest in the work, which stems from their original nature, is something different from this work's own peculiar interest, which is thereby converted into something different. Thus the work is in general something perishable, which is obliterated by the counteraction of other forces and interests, and really exhibits the reality of the individuality as vanishing rather than as achieved. Consciousness, then, in doing its work, is aware of the antithesis of doing and being, which in the earlier shapes of consciousness was at the same time the beginning of action, while here it is only a result. But in fact this antithesis was likewise the foundation, in that consciousness proceeded to act as an implicitly real individuality, for the action presupposed a specific original nature as the in itself of the individuality, and the content of that nature was achievement simply for the sake of achievement. Pure action, however, is a self-identical form, with which, therefore, the specific character of the original nature is not in agreement. Here, as elsewhere, it is a matter of indifference which of the two is called notion and which reality. The original nature has only an ideal existence, or is the in itself, in contrast to the action in which it first becomes a reality. Or, in other words, the original nature is the being both of the individuality as such and of the individuality in the form of work, while action is the original notion as an absolute transition, or as the coming to be of the reality. This disparity between notion and reality, which lies in its essence, is learnt by consciousness from experience in its work. In work, therefore, consciousness becomes what it is in truth, and its empty notion of itself vanishes. In this fundamental contradiction, inherent in work, which is the truth of this essentially real individuality, all the aspects of the individuality thus appear again as contradictory. That is to say, the work, qua the content of the whole individuality, when transferred from the doing of it, which is the negative unity holding captive all the moments of that content, now lets the moments go free, and in the element of existence they become indifferent to one another. Notion and reality are thus separated into purpose and that which is the original essentiality. It is accidental if the purpose has a true essential nature, or if the in itself is made the purpose. Even so, notion and reality again fall apart as a transition to reality and as purpose. In other words, it is accidental if a means is chosen which expresses the purpose. And finally, the entirety of these inner moments, whether they possess an inner unity or not, that is, the action of the individual, is again in an accidental relationship to reality in general. Fortune decides as well in favour of an ill-disposed purpose, and an ill-chosen means as against them. If now consciousness is thus made aware in its work of the antithesis of willing and achieving between end and means, and again between this inner nature in its entirety and reality itself, an antithesis which in general includes within it the contingency of its action, yet the unity of necessity and the action are no less present too. The latter aspect overlaps the former, and the experience of the contingency of the action is itself only a contingent experience. The necessity of the action consists in the fact that purpose is related simply to actuality, and this unity is the notion of action. Action takes place because action is in and for itself, the essence of actuality. In the work, it is true, there is revealed the contingency possessed by achievement when contrasted with willing and doing, and this experience, which seems as if it must be accepted as truth, contradicts the notion of action. If, however, we consider the content of this experience in its completeness, it is seen to be the vanishing work. What is preserved is not the vanishing is itself actual, and is bound up with the work, and vanishes with it. The negativity itself perishes along with positive whose negative it is. Along with the positive whose negative it is. Oh, I think I'll go for a nap now.